Hey, Bonnie Crater, and welcome to the Tick Bootcamp podcast.
Thank you for having me, Rich.
So I have to let folks know that we've really been anxious to get you on this podcast for a long time. And there are a few folks that our audience reaches out to us and asks to get onto this podcast on a pretty regular basis. And I want you and our community to know that you're one of those people. We've probably had 30 or 40 inquiries over the course of the last couple of years where folks want to know about you and your story and your great work. So I just first want to let you know that. And I also want to thank you for taking the time out of your really busy schedule to join us.
Well, it certainly is an honor to hear that people want to hear my story.
I have really good news for folks as well. My good friend Nicole Bell is actually going to be our co-host today, and folks have always enjoyed Nicole and the work that she's done with us. And Nicole, why don't you say hi to the folks and just give us a brief background? You were just co-hosting with me a couple of weeks ago, but just give us for the folks who are new to this episode or who hadn't heard your story before, just outline for folks your background and some of the things you're doing in the community, Nicole.
Yeah, so it's a pleasure to be here and to be talking to Bonnie and Rich. I, like a lot of people, was kind of thrown into the tick-borne community when my husband got sick. I've an engineer by training, and so I really just started to try and dig in and try and understand it and pick it apart and figure out what was going on. And I got so frustrated, right? It was a terrible experience that we had to live through. And the journey was so transformative. I wrote a book about it called What Lurks in the Woods, about our story. Unfortunately, our journey didn't end well. And my husband he had a neurological Lyme and ended up with early onset Alzheimer's disease. And but that whole process was so transformative that I knew I had to do something with that information. And so I wrote the book. Now I'm actually also the chief business officer at Galaxy Diagnostics, helping to solve the problem of the inaccurate diagnostics that are out there. And then most recently, I have been working with Bonnie on a paper for the Center for Lyme Action, which we'll probably talk about at some point, to summarize the state of Lyme research. And so I think my journey is, now trying to figure out how to make it better for new patients and getting as active and connected as I can.
This is so exciting. It is so exciting. So, Bonnie, let's talk about first where you are currently, meaning where are you physically located, and talk to us about what organizations you're doing most of your work with today. We're going to talk about how you got there, but let's just let the folks who are not yet familiar with you know, the important role that you're playing in the community today.
Yeah, so I'm sitting in my house in Portola Valley, California, which is a small town halfway between San Francisco and San Jose. And I have a couple of kids and work on a couple of organizations that I started with my friend, really good friend, Lori Woods. And we started Bay Area Lyme Foundation, as well as the Center for Lyme Action, together with a whole bunch of other people, whose work I'm super grateful for.
So let's talk about your background, your childhood. Where'd you grow up, and what was your vision for your future when you were making your way through your younger years?
So I grew up in Virginia, and as a high school kid, I loved science, and I really loved microbiology. And I ended up going to Princeton and getting a biology degree. So I spent some time in New Jersey, and then I met my husband in college, and we moved to California in 1988. And I started a career in tech because I was just very kind of a curious person. So I ended up being very curious about technology. And my last real job was I just sold my company. I was CEO of a software company called Full Circle Insights. And but along that journey, I had a couple of kids, and my daughter Jen was in a Girl Scout troop. And we had 6 moms and 6 girls in our little town in Portola Valley. The town is 5,000 people. It's pretty rural, right? There's 300 horses and I don't know how many, lots of, maybe double the number of chickens in our town. And we, it's like a small school system. Pretty much everybody knows each other. And it's a special place where there's a lot of people that are very inventive. And so when we saw a problem in our Girl Scout trip, so 2 of the moms of the Girl Scouts, they got really sick and they were diagnosed with Lyme disease when our daughters were around 11. And they were really sick, like crawling to the bathroom kind of sick, and we honestly thought they were dying. So literally the Girl Scout moms, this is like a Girl Scout thing. The Girl Scout moms got together, and once a month we would meet at a friend's house, and we'd have a speaker come to teach us about Lyme disease, because none of us knew anything about it. And about 3 or 4 months into it, it turned out we knew each other well as moms and moms of our girls, but we didn't know each other's talents. So it turned out that one of the Girl Scout moms, who was also sick with Lyme, my friend Lori, said, "Oh, my family does foundations. We should start a foundation." And I said, "Well, I start companies, so we should I can help you." And another person said, "Yeah, I like to host parties." And anyway, so there were all these talents of people around us, and so we decided to start Bay Area Lyme Foundation at that time.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you to hit the pause button there for a second, because I want to learn more about the companies that you started and how things developed when you left Princeton. So you're an Ivy League grad with a degree in biology, and you said you had a passion for microbiology. So I'm assuming you knew something about Lyme disease before you moved out west.
Not really. I knew, I liked, I liked microbiology. I took a lot of classes in that area. I was, was a kid that tried, won the science prize in high school, because, was always running some experiments. I went to University of Richmond as a teenager, and they let me use a lot of materials in this lab to run a bunch of experiments with. Anyway, so I just had a lot of curiosity. I ended up in the tech business because I was also curious about this thing called computers, and I kind of stuck with that for my work career until this time, when our friends got so sick with Lyme disease, and we decided to start a foundation that would raise money and fund research projects.
So, Bonnie, one of the things that I find shocking as a native of Long Island, or almost a native of Long Island. I was born in New York City, and then when we were 2, my parents moved out to Long Island. Ticks were always a part of our lives. I was always aware of ticks. We were always pulling ticks off of us, pulling ticks off our companion animals. So when I speak to folks, especially someone like you who grew up in Virginia, which also has there's a huge problem with Lyme disease in Virginia now. Certainly alpha-gal is taken off in Virginia. Yeah, right. I'm always surprised when folks tell me that they just weren't aware of these tick diseases. So were you not aware at all of ticks and tick diseases? Was it not a part of your childhood and your college experience, or were you aware of it but just not aware that it could cause people to become chronically ill?
I would say I had a very, very, very low awareness of the whole issue. So
and let's again talk a little bit more about your education at Princeton. You went to one of the top schools in the country, and you majored in biology. Was there any discussion about ticks and tick diseases and the possibility of ticks being vectors to bring diseases from the animal population to the human population?
No, I not really. That wasn't really part of my education. I studied human evolution. I wrote my thesis on human evolution, and it was not really part of my education. I still had an interest in microbiology, but it wasn't really a feature. Talking about ticks and tick-borne disease was not a feature of my education for sure.
So now, one of the things that I'm really interested in is why you turned to the for-profit model as a career model, right? You spent a lot of time in the not-for-profit model, in the foundational model, in the educational model, in the research model. I mean, there are a lot of different models that are a part of this Lyme disease world, but you began your career in the for-profit model. So talk to us about entrepreneurship and businesses, and why that was the place where you thought your talents would best serve you and your community.
Well, I always had a idea that I wanted to start companies. That I remember doing some job interviews that were unsuccessful when I was at Princeton, and I told the interviewer that I wanted to start my own business, and then I did not get the job. Anyway, yeah, note to self. Don't say that.
Don't tell your employer you may be a competitor.
Yeah. So, yeah, so I always had an interest in starting businesses. When I was at Princeton, we started a little hat company that was successful. And I was, when we moved, my partner, who became my husband, we moved to outside of Washington, D.C. I talked my way into getting jobs in the computer industry. It's called computers and not tech then.
Right.
Computer industry then, and one day, a guy came to the store that I was running. I ran a computer store. We sold PCs and other kinds of computers. Anyway, so the guy came to the computer store and said, "Hey, my wife and I are starting this business. Will you come install this thing and teach and set up a database and teach us how to use it?" So that was I didn't really know what I was doing, but there were a lot of books on a shelf. So I read a lot of books and kind of self-taught and started a consulting business based on that.
That's really cool. So always willing to take risks and always willing to venture into new places to help folks that need the help that they need.
Yeah, I'm basically a very curious person, and I've always liked to learn new things. So and getting paid to learn things, I thought was a much better way than paying someone else to learn something.
Certainly is, but it's also a place where you can serve at the highest level, right? I mean, one of the things that we talk about in the community all the time is how in many cases, folks who have Lyme disease are very critical of others who go into the entrepreneurial space. And the argument is, you're essentially trying to make money on the backs of sick people. And our argument in response to that is that there are some unique features to the entrepreneurial model. Most importantly, that you're serving directly and you're getting direct feedback from the folks who you're serving. Because if you're not doing a good job, you're not going to get paid. And if you don't get paid, you're going to have to continue to get that feedback from folks in the community. So I like to build out that process, because I think in many cases, folks in the Lyme community are hurting themselves by not working with folks in the entrepreneurial space. And we want to talk a little bit later. We're going to talk about this a little bit later about how bringing things to market can only be brought through the entrepreneurial model. And I'm just interested in again, because you've been in so many different spaces, how you believe that was the best place for you to serve at the early stage of your career.
Yeah. And at Bay Area Lyme Foundation, we really leveraged the Silicon Valley model of entrepreneurship. And when we started Bay Area Lyme Foundation, we believed that we were going to do seed funding. So, when you start your company in Silicon Valley, you get the initial funding. It's called seed funding. And we wanted we didn't have, billions of dollars. We had some money, and we wanted to use that that money to stimulate much more research and provide seed funding for early stage projects. So then those researchers could go to the NIH and get a lot more funding, a lot more money than we could ever have, a lot more money to take that research. But our goal really was to develop products, right? To provide seed funding for research that could be adopted, that could be further funded by the NIH and then adopted by companies to bring to market. So that was our entire vision.
That is really cool, and we're going to get there. Let's move forward a little bit more in your journey. So you and your husband at some point now move out to California. So what called you to California? And then I do want to build out a little bit more on your experiences as a parent of a scout, and maybe I don't know if you were a scout leader or not, but I do want to build out a little bit more. But so you moved to California. Talk to us about that and how that experience was for your family.
Yeah, so we got in the car. We said goodbye. My mom cried because she didn't think she was ever going to see us again. And we drove out to California because Chris wanted to go to business school. So we moved to Palo Alto. And lived on the Stanford campus. And I found a job at Oracle, where I stayed for about 10 years in a variety of different jobs, and was trained in all things tech at Oracle.
Wow, that's really cool. You just found a job at Oracle. I just so happened to find one there. So let's talk
There's
about.
a funny story about that, but I don't know if you're ready for that.
Okay, no, give us some insight, because I want to know how the Oracle experience and how this all led to you starting these cool not-for-profits that you've started.
So we had moved to California, and we'd actually shipped all of our stuff out to California. Are you ready for my story here? Okay.
We are.
We'd shipped all to a friend of my husband's sister in Oakland, and we were driving across country, and we're at not Yosemite. We were at the Yellowstone, the other Y park at Yellowstone, and we get a call from my mom. I'm like, they've died or something. We were very worried, but it was someone has broken into your stuff that's stored in California. So we zipped out from Yellowstone, as fast as we could possibly get to Oakland. And it turned out our stuff was being stored in a broken down garage in a very bad neighborhood. And literally street people that were going into the garage with their shopping carts, taking all of our stuff and doing as they would. So it was a little bit of a rough start. But so we gathered up all our things, put it, rented a U-Haul, put it in a van. And while we were there, we met a couple of grad students that went to Berkeley, and I was looking at them giving them a little side eye, because they were the ones that were supposed to be supervising our things, which were getting stolen by all the neighbors. Anyway, but one of them turned out to be a recruiter. And basically that's how I got my job at Oracle.
I love that story.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in exchange for all your stuff, you got a job.
Yeah, I did get a job. Anyway, so we moved to the Stanford campus. Chris went to work, and I went to work for Oracle.
All right. So now let's talk about California and the culture shock. And of course, most people believe that there's no Lyme disease in California, but little did you know that not only was there Lyme disease, but it was going to touch your family and have a direct impact on your daughter's scouting experience. So talk to us about scouting and why you thought that was an activity that would be enriching for your child, and how it became more than enriching, or more enriching in a way than you thought it would.
Yeah. So Jen was born in in 2001, and so it was around 2010 that she was in this scouting group. She started off as a brownie and then became a Girl Scout, and I was very busy with my career and various other hobbies. But we all made a point, literally 6 moms and 6 girls, of going on the camping trip and selling cookies and and doing some volunteer projects. It wasn't a huge amount of time, but we actually had a lot of fun together. It was a social group for us, and the girls all learned a little bit from their moms.
So now, Bonnie, I have 4 daughters, all of whom were in Scouts. And, one of the things that I thought was interesting as the father and Lyme-aware dad that I am, is that despite, Scouting being an enriching experience for all 4 of my daughters, they never learned anything about ticks, and they never learned anything about Lyme disease before they were going out on any of these outdoor events.
Yeah,
so,
100%.
Yeah. So, and we're on Long Island. I mean, there are ticks everywhere. I mean, if you were sitting in my backyard with me, I'd be telling you, make sure you do a tick check when you come in, because we have ticks everywhere, and the Lone Star ticks are really aggressive. Yet, there does not seem to be an element of the scouting experience where, this is a part of the training. And that seems like that's the same case that you saw in California. My youngest daughter, by the way, is a year older than your daughter. So maybe things have changed, but certainly back when our children were young, that just wasn't something that was available. So what's your reaction to that?
Yeah, for sure. We went on a lot of camping trips. No one discussed anything about any ticks or anything. No, we had a little bug spray, but that was about it.
So now build out for us before Nicole starts to take you through, your journey with starting the first and then the second not-for-profit that you were a part of. Build out for us in some more detail, what was happening with the folks who were sick and ultimately diagnosed with Lyme disease. And was there this window where they were sick and they weren't able to participate, but they struggled to get a diagnosis?
Yeah. So our friends who were like these really smart, dynamic women became very stricken with very bad symptoms, like could not get out of bed. They were not, they had a lot of brain fog and were not coherent. They lost tons of weight. At first they were happy about, but then they were literally emaciated and they looked like heck. And then we literally thought they were going to die. So the girls, all the girls became very aware of course, of Lyme disease. So that was a learning experience for the girls. But we felt compelled that our friends were so sick that we really needed to do something. At first, it was just a minor commitment of, kind of just learning about how we might be able to help them. But I remember sitting with one friend and talking about how we would take care of her children when she died, because she was so sick. And so about month 5 in our journey of our monthly 2-hour session with a doctor or a researcher, someone who started a foundation, these different people that came as to tell us about Lyme disease, we realized that there was not a lot it felt to us that there was not a lot known about the disease, that there wasn't a lot of activity in this 2010, 2011 type timeframe that we were starting to learn about this. And we felt that there wasn't that much money, federal money, that was being put into it. It didn't feel like there was that doctors really had all the information they needed in order to be effective at doing anything to help our friends.
Yeah, but Bonnie, before you get to the macro, let's stay with the micro for a minute, right? So
Okay.
you have this small, tight-knit group of folks, 6 moms, six children, and 2 of the moms are getting very, very sick, and you don't know what is wrong with them. They don't know what is wrong with them, and then you finally hear about this Lyme disease. Who got diagnosed first, without names, and what was your reaction as a biologist about this disease, Lyme disease, that you didn't seem to know a whole lot about?
Yeah. So one of our friends was diagnosed, and the other friend, we were like literally sitting around the kitchen table, was after a Girl Scout event. Yeah, your symptoms seem to be the same as mine. You should go get a Lyme test. And she did, and was diagnosed, and the second friend was diagnosed with Lyme disease.
Now, Bonnie, is it your suspicion that one or both of these women were bitten by ticks while you all were scouting together, or do you think there was something else?
I don't think so. They both shared a keen interest in equestrian activities. They both rode horses as a young child. And then we also found out that one of them's mom had Lyme disease and her aunt had Lyme disease. She actually, there's a lot of Lyme disease in her family, and we don't know if it was congenital or what, but there's definitely a family history of Lyme disease, and also the equestrian angle as well.
So now, as responsible scouting parents, you now decide that you're going to reach out to folks who have experience in this disease, and you want this to be an enriching experience for your children. So you start bringing these like Lyme geeks to your scout meetings to give you talks about Lyme. Talk to us about how that was inspired, and how did the children respond to these folks coming in and giving these talks?
Well, I don't know I think the girls were off playing in another room while we were learning about Lyme disease, actually, but we definitely updated them on what we found. And so they became acutely aware, because 2 of the moms in the group were very sick.
So now Nicole's going to take you through now this personal experience that you had as the inspiration for going from the micro, where you had, you know, really, really sick people you were all as a part of a close knit group, to now recognizing, as a result of not just their experiences, but the effort to try to turn this into an enriching experience for your children, you now start to see these macro issues that have to be dealt with. So I'll let Nicole take you through that.
Well, I mean, I think what I love about your story so far is that, you know, each of you have these unique talents, which you're presented with this problem, right? And now all of a sudden you're saying, well, hey, my family sets up foundations and I'm an entrepreneur and I like to do event planning. And then you decide to just build the thing, right? And to go figure it out. And I mean, and I think you had shared with me once a story about, you know, you're basically trying to get a Stanford, you know, scientist to go out and study this at a picnic table. Like, just tell that story about how you even started and even got the gumption to go and do something like that.
Well, so I decided that we needed to go we're next to this university, Stanford University. I thought, oh my God, there's all these very smart people there. They study lots of disease problems. I'm sure there's someone there that wants to work on Lyme disease. And so I decided I did some research, and I made myself a slide deck. So I'm the mom from Portola Valley, Girl Scout mom from Portola Valley. And I start, trying to network and poke around. So I go over and visit, someone takes my meeting over at Stanford as a researcher. And I start showing him my slides and like, some ideas for research projects. And he says, you should go talk to Jay. I'm like, who's Jay? Anyway, so that was one of our first researchers that started working on Lyme disease at Stanford, Dr. Jay Rajadas. And then, of course, I was also a polo player, so I had an equestrian thing going on with me as well. And so we used to play polo with the Stanford polo team. So I asked some of my polo teammates who I knew were also biology majors, and asked them about who they knew. Did they, are you doing any work on, do you know anybody who's working on ticks or, this on Lyme disease? And it turned out there was a researcher that was doing tick collections in Portola Valley, like doing tick drags in Portola Valley. And so I was connected up, by the Stanford kids with some of them. Anyway, we were just sort of networked around, and we found these people that were willing to start working on a couple of research projects on behalf of the foundation.
Well, because I mean, at this time, right, and even, still to this day, right, there's a lot of people that think, well, Lyme disease doesn't exist in certain parts of the country, right? And California was definitely at that time one of the places where Lyme disease doesn't exist, right? You're not in the Northeast, not there.
Yeah.
So like mission number one is to go figure that out, right? Why were people getting sick?
And that was a big problem for our friends. One of our friends literally went to 50 doctors. It's that same story. They go to 50 doctors, can't get a diagnosis. Then they chat with their other friends and they suggest to get the Lyme test, and they've got now they're diagnosed with Lyme disease. So now they at least know what they've got. So that in Northern California, particularly at that time, it was not only that doctors would say there's no Lyme disease. There were some people that said, oh, it had kind of a fraudulent tone to these are physicians suggesting that the whole thing is a fraud. And I found it incredulous. So that's when I really knew that we had to get to work to try to educate people that this was a real disease. And yes, you can get it here in California. So one of the first projects that we wanted to fund was, let's, it seemed like we had an epidemic. 2 of the 6 moms, that's, a third of the moms got Lyme disease. So we thought, oh my God, we have like a Lyme disease epidemic. Mm-hmm. So maybe the ticks are carrying Lyme disease at a very high rate here in California. So that was one of our first hypotheses. So that was one of the first studies that we funded, was to do tick drags around our town to see what the rate of prevalence of Borrelia burgdorferi was in the ticks, to see if that was why we seemed to have this problem with our friends. And So we were very motivated to just try to basically help our friends. In fact, that was our first tagline was everyone has a friend with Lyme.
Yeah. So you find these scientists, you kind of do your networking thing over at Stanford, you find these scientists. Fortunately, one of them had done tick drags, right? And so, and that was your first project, right? Going out and doing tick drags and seeing if these ticks in fact do harbor, Borrelia burgdorferi, the bacteria causing Lyme disease. And so, what did you all find? And then how was that information received?
Well, we did tick drags for many years in a row. And all over the Bay Area. Then we expanded outside the Bay, the San Francisco Bay Area. We did one in Oregon, we did one in Texas, we did one in Minnesota. Anyway, we did tick drags in a bunch of different places. And what we found is that in the Bay Area, that there was it was very patchy. It's quite interesting, actually. So you go to one park, right, and 0% of the ticks are infected with Borrelia burgdorferi. You go to another park and it's 20% of the ticks are infected with Borrelia. And so that was a very interesting finding, because on average across the whole state of California, it was about 1 to 2%. But in the Bay Area, it was this very patchy condition. So if you're unlucky to get bit in the patch that had the 20% prevalence rate, that was a problem. But if you're lucky and you got bit in the 0%, you're lucky. So that was a very interesting and key finding that we found.
So how is this received, right? Because now you have evidence that shows that this bacteria is living in California that causes this, quote unquote, fraudulent disease. Right. So, how was that received by, the scientific community, the medical community? Like, where did you go with that information?
So we decided to use all of our ecology studies. So we called all of our tick dragging and the related matters. Then we called those ecology studies. We decided to use that as our public relations campaign. And that had worked very well for us, because there were many radio stations, TV stations, newspapers that wanted to write articles about this phenomena that seemed rare, but it wasn't so rare, and people were really suffering. So it was a very important and almost new story for the news media, and they actually picked it up, and it became a way for us to promote education around Lyme disease, and get people involved and try to help.
Okay, so for any person, or Girl Scout mom or entrepreneur, whatever, that would be an accomplishment in and of itself, right? To prove that a disease exists where it shouldn't. But of course, you don't stop there, right? You decide to take Bay Area Lyme and do bigger, things. So maybe talk about the founding of Bay Area Lyme and kind of the early days in the mission and what you guys were thinking. You said you were kind of thinking about using that entrepreneurial spirit to seed businesses. Like, how did that go from tick drags to entrepreneurial seeding? Like, tell us how that evolved.
Yeah. So we were fortunate enough to get a grant of a $5 million grant to start the foundation. So that's the first thing.
Okay.
So we had a foundational set of money to work with. So that's number one. Number two is that our very original vision was to just educate people in our town, because, we lived in a community where people went to all sorts of fancy schools and had all sorts of fancy degrees, but most people did not know anything about Lyme disease. And so that was kind of originally what we thought we would be doing. But as we got into it and we all started reading, talking to people, we realized that there was, oh my gosh, there's no really good diagnostic. And if you get this disease, if you get bit by the tick and it happens to infect you with Borrelia burgdorferi, and you don't get the antibiotics early on, it can stay with you forever, for your entire life. And there's no good therapeutic. And so we found these two facts to be completely horrendous. And so over about 6 months into it, we, or maybe it was a year into it, we really got focusing on our mission, which was coined by Wendy Adams. I always like to give her credit for this because it's really clever, actually. is to make Lyme disease easy to diagnose and simple to cure.
I mean, it sounds so simple, but that is like, that's the challenge. That's a ginormous wall and challenge, right? But it sounds so simple.
It does sound very simple, but, and I had a little bit of anger about this because I thought, oh my gosh, there's been antibiotics for 100 years. Why don't any of the existing antibiotics work against Borrelia burgdorferi? What are the doctors doing? Why isn't anybody studying this? This is silly.
Yep. Okay, so you have your mission, right? Now, how to make Lyme disease easy to diagnose and simple to cure. Where do you go from there? Like, what was your next move?
So then we really focused on trying to fund early stage projects and leverage the Silicon Valley model, entrepreneurship model. So funding early stage projects so that there would be other funding organizations that could pick them up for later stage type funding and actually turn those ideas into products, diagnostics, and therapies.
So maybe pick one of those projects and kind of give an example of one of your early fundings that's kind of, been ongoing.
Okay, let's see. So
not put you on the spot or anything.
Yeah, put you on the spot. Okay. Okay, let's see. Okay, so early on, we had two really brilliant people that joined our organization, Wendy Adams and Karin Rollins. And they partnered with some folks on the East Coast to try to figure out why, what were the things that were holding us back from actually having a good diagnostic. So they partnered up with the government, actually, NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Testing, and held a meeting. This is a couple of years after we founded it. Had a meeting to try to understand what was really a factor in holding up researchers from actually creating diagnostics. And so there was a survey done, and it became very clear that one of the factors that was really holding research back was just the availability of patient samples for Lyme disease. And so there were a couple of existing biobanks around the country, but many of them were being used privately for specific projects that were happening at that university. So the samples were not widely available to any researcher, any who had a good project and just needed samples to try to create a good diagnostic. So so it became clear that we needed to start a biobank. And we had a couple of starting a biobank is not easy. It's very tricky to, you have, getting the protocols, getting the IRBs, getting the site set up. It's a very complex operation. But we were fortunate to find Liz Horn, who was a PI and she had set up biobanks for cancer. So this was right up her alley. And so she's been our PI for the Lyme disease biobank. So fast forward, that project is highly leveraged, right? So if you collect the samples, a lot of researchers can use those samples in projects that are all over the country, all over the United States. So when we started Bay Area Lyme Foundation, I think there's, Karin actually did a study on this. So there's probably 10 or 15 viable Lyme diagnostic projects around the United States. And the Lyme disease biobank has supplied samples to over 80 projects now. So there are these 80 projects that are going on now. So the multiplier effect was really, really high on that by just making patient samples available to those researchers.
So I love that you picked that as your example, because that's like my favorite thing. As somebody who believes wholeheartedly that diagnostics is the root of so many issues, right? Getting that accurate test that tells you exactly what bacteria or parasites or whatever you're harboring in your body is key, right? And if you're trying to develop a new diagnostic, you can't do that without samples that have been flagged and are known to have positives and negatives. You need positive controls, you need negative controls. You need to understand and have well-characterized patient samples that is just not available until, like the Bay Area Lyme, biobank basically put together. And so I think that's huge. And to do that, and I love that it kind of came out of a hackathon where people are like, what's the problem and how can we solve it? I mean, I think it's fantastic. And so that is a crucial research. And now we have, projects ongoing. We have the Lyme Action challenge and all sorts of new diagnostic solutions coming out. And these biobanks are essential, right? To get that information and to know what you have.
Yeah. And so, I'm now fairly, optimistic that we're, I believe that we're less than 5 years away now of having a good diagnostic, that will probably probably complement the current serology tests that will help us diagnose patients much, much earlier and much, much better.
Well, and the other thing that y'all are doing is, providing that seed funding. And as part of that, you have this other program and initiative that I am a big fan of, which is the Emerging Leader Award, right? It's trying to get new researchers into the space and to kind of recruit new talent for, showing that there's funding available. So talk a little bit about that program, how it started and where it is now.
Well, as I say, and when we started the foundation, there are people that wanted to have parties and they were good at having parties. And so when you have a party and you're working to raise money for a disease space, it's good to award, to have a public award and honor folks that are doing great work in the space. And so that became part of our agenda to really focus on having young researchers in a very public award. These would be postdocs or, young assistant professors in universities who are at the very beginning of their career, and really kick them off and hopefully get them started so they could have a career in solving our Lyme disease problem. So that was really our vision around it. And we were grateful for the various funders that we have had along the way that have funded the Emerging Leader Award, because it's been a great program, and many of those projects are still ongoing and getting closer and closer to a diagnostic or therapy.
And so, going back to what you said earlier, you said the original vision, well, not the original vision, but the modified vision that you came to is to kind of provide seed funding, which then goes to get NIH funding, which then goes into companies to kind of fuel solutions into the space, right? But somewhere along the way, you realized that there was a challenge with that transition from seed to graduating. So what did you learn as you kind of went through this process?
Well, one of the dynamics that was happening was, some of these projects would actually succeed, right? And so they no longer needed seed money; they needed much bigger grants. So we were able to accommodate some, but not all, right? We really needed help, funding sources to get these projects going to the next stage. And around 2017, 2018, I started thinking about this a lot, and how I started noticing around how the government funding was continued to be flat. In fact, one stat I noted, it was actually on a, if you looked at the funding, it was actually in real dollars, it was actually less funding now than it was in 2001. So the funding wasn't going up, it was actually going down.
Yeah.
But the cases were tripling and quadrupling. It didn't make any sense.
Yep.
So I thought, we really need to do something about that. And also, Bay Area Lyme Foundation can do a lot, but it needs, this takes a village to solve this problem. And so I felt that we really needed a companion organization to focus on increasing federal funding for Lyme and tick-borne disease research. And so Bay Area Lyme Foundation allowed me to do a project, an experimental project. So, we're all about experiments in our research. So we decided to do experimental project to see if there was any interest by members of Congress in Lyme disease, and whether they would be receptive to helping us increase federal funding. But along the way, I met a kind of a famous Congresswoman, Barbara Lee. She's from the Bay Area. She's at an event, and I said, Barbara, I'm trying to do this thing, increase federal funding for Lyme disease, and I don't really know where to begin. She said, you need a lobbyist. You don't need a lot, you just need one. Anyway, I was happy to visit my brother Jeff, and oddly enough, his kids were just diagnosed with Lyme disease, and I'm like, Jeff, I've been working on this for 5 or 6 years now. And anyways, we had a discussion and I didn't really know what he did for a living. This is my little brother Jeff, who lives outside of Washington, D.C. And apparently I learned that he's a professional lobbyist and knew a lot about appropriations and funding and all that. And
that's pretty hysterical that you didn't even know what he did.
Yeah, not really. I didn't really know what he did. Because I was, in the middle of this, high tech thing and Silicon Valley, that whole thing, and I knew he did something with the government. I didn't really know what it was. Anyway, so we were chatting, and I said, well, do you think that one could, talk to Congress about and influence and try to get them to add more money for Lyme disease? He says, yeah, that's how this all works, Bonnie. So anyway, so he started educating me on this. So when I went back to Bay Area Lyme Foundation, I said, yeah, my brother is a lobbyist. We've been advised that we need a lobbyist. My brother's a lobbyist, and he has 2 kids with Lyme disease. So he has a horse in this race, and he is really interested in helping.
And thus the Center for Lyme Action was born.
Well, we did our study. My brother and I, we created some materials, and we walked around the Hill and talked and went to some different congressional offices. We made some appointments and some drop-ins, and we found that that members of Congress, both on the Senate and the House side, were actually quite interested to help, and that this was an area that they really wanted to spend some time on. There was an issue that they wanted to invest time in. So we were very encouraged. We gave our report back to Bay Area Lyme Foundation, and Bay Area Lyme Foundation. Then we spent a long time trying to figure out how we should structure the organization. Should this lobbying effort be part of Bay Area Lyme Foundation, or should it be a separate organization? And it was decided that we would create a separate organization that was not a 501c3, but a 501c4 that could do unlimited lobbying.
Okay.
Now, the funding for a 501c4 is not tax deductible. So you have to find people that are willing to part with money to fund this operation, right? And not get a tax deduction for it.
Okay.
So we felt that was kind of a challenge, but we seem to have risen through that issue. But Bay Area Lyme Foundation spun off Center for Lyme Action as a separate organization. And 5 individuals and foundations became the charter members of the organization. It's a member-funded organization, and we started organizing with our first event in October of 2019.
And so describe that process, right? So you get a new organization, and what's your mission? I mean, your mission is to grow, research funding for Lyme, I would imagine. But how do you go about achieving that mission? What's your first steps? And about the same time, the Kay Hagan Tick Act was brewing, and all sorts of things. Like, how did that all come together?
Well, I feel like in my particular Lyme journey, although I've seen a lot of suffering and so on, I felt like there's been a lot of good luck along the way and a lot of serendipitous kinds of activities that have happened in my journey to try to help solve this problem. So when we had our event in October of 2019, we about 100 people came. We had speakers from the House and the Senate that gave remarks. We had a panel and so on. And our audience was, was largely advocates, Lyme advocates who were dying to get to Washington to talk to members of Congress. But also we had some staff. And one of the staff that came was in Susan Collins's office, Senator Susan Collins from Maine. And as you may know, Maine is a highly, highly endemic state for Lyme disease, highly, highly endemic. And so it's a big problem for the Maine senators. And they were both Maine senators were very interested. So earlier that year, and we were new at this, so we didn't actually know, but the KHEG and TIC Act, or there were several pieces of legislation that had been introduced, and Susan Collins had introduced a piece of legislation that was based on legislation from Chris Smith in the House, which he had introduced many times before. And so we had our event, and then the next day we were walking around the Hill, and we got a call from Senator Collins's office, and they asked us to come visit their office so they could talk to us about the TIC Act that they had created. And so it was myself and my brother Jeff and my dear friend Lori Woods, who we all went. We were having an exciting time going over to the Senate and the Senate office building, and we went to Senator Collins's office, and we chatted with the staff, and they explained to us that they had this bill, and they had 3 co-sponsors, and they needed more co-sponsors. So when you're trying to get a bill done, what you do is you ask your colleagues say that if you're in the Senate in this case, to formally say, I think this bill is a good idea, and that's called being a co-sponsor. And so so we were given after our event, we thought, oh wow, this is great, we're in business, we have a real project to work on that will help raise visibility for Lyme and tick-borne disease. And so the advocates were very, very responsive, and they called and emailed their senators in various states, and we ended up with 33 co-sponsors for that bill, which is a lot of co-sponsors. So that means a third of the Senate is saying, hey, I think this bill is a good idea.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of momentum for this bill. And then really sadly, while we were in the middle of this, we had our event in October. Shortly thereafter, one of the former senators, Kay Hagan, died.
Yeah, from North Carolina, my state. Yes.
Yeah, from your state, exactly.
Yes.
Of a tick-borne illness. And so the bill was renamed the Kay Hagan Tick Act.
Yeah. And
the bill ended up becoming part of the appropriations bill for that year. So it was for FY20, and it was signed into law at the end of December. So this never happens, okay? The thing that I'm just telling you never happens in a million years. We have an event that staff calls you in, says, we have a bill that we're trying to get co-sponsors. You get 33 co-sponsors on the bill. That never happens either. The bill is renamed, sadly, for a former senator who dies.
From Powassan virus.
Yeah, Powassan virus, right.
Yep.
Exactly. And then literally 2 months after you learn about this bill, it's passed into law. Okay, that never happens. So we felt like we were, it was a big celebration because, bills take years and years, and most do not get passed at all. So we felt that this was a very good sign, and we could continue on. So thanks for asking about that.
Well, and I'm gonna hand it back to Rich soon, because I know he's dying to ask you like a bajillion questions. But before I do that, I want to ask a question, because there's a theme through your story that I just love, and it's about the people that are affected kind of using their talents, right? So you've got these 3 moms, with the moms and your Girl Scout troop that are all good at different things and adding. Then you've got your brother that you don't even know what he does for a living, and it just happens that he's a lobbyist when you exactly need a lobbyist at that point in time in your journey. And so you've got all these people that are using their random talents that have their lives impacted by tick-borne illness. And so I guess I want to ask you for, from a personal perspective and for maybe anybody else who has a situation, how do you, like, what advice would you give to somebody who has, been in a situation where their life gets totally turned upside down by tick-borne illness, by Lyme and so forth, and they want to make a difference, right? But you don't necessarily know how your talents are going to fit in and make a difference. Like, what advice would you give to them? Because I mean, there's so much to your story and with what you've done. And some of it, like you said, is luck. Some of it is like hard work and just being where you are. But I guess, what would your thoughts be for that person who's trying to figure out where to take their journey?
Well, I've met so many wonderful people along the way, and everybody's got a talent. Their story is their talent, or maybe they're good at organizing something, or maybe they're good at very detailed descriptions and writing those things down. Maybe they're good at organizing parties, but everyone has a talent, and Lyme disease needs your talent, whatever it is. We need it. And there's loads of organizations that can use your talent. We're lucky enough, we have 2,000 dedicated advocates across the country at Center for Lyme Action who dedicate their time and talent to talk to their senators, write their Congress folks, and be active. And that's their gift and their talent that they provide for themselves, their family, their friends that are suffering from this disease. So everyone's got something they can offer, and there's a lot of different organizations that you can apply your talent to.
That is really powerful, Bonnie, because every human being is unique and special. Every one of us has some special God-given talent that we can lend to any cause. And one of the things we see in the Lyme community, because contribution is a basic human need, but when folks are really sick and they're just trying to get a diagnosis and trying to get a handle on what they need to do in order to be able to try to get on a journey to recovery, they feel like they can't contribute. And I think it's really powerful that you have done so much and offered so many different opportunities for folks in the Lyme disease community where they can find a place where they can get that basic human need of contribution by joining one of the many efforts that you've created. So talk to us a little bit about how contribution is a basic human need, how that is often taken away from people with Lyme disease, and how so much of what you've been able to accomplish has been the result of sick people contributing to this cause.
Yeah. I'm a big believer in values. When you start an organization, it's kind of like, how do you show up? And one of our key values is to be humane as an organization for Center for Lyme Action. And because there's a lot of sick people out there, but not everybody's sick all the time with Lyme disease. When you wake up and you have Lyme disease, you might have a really good day and you might feel good. And that's a great day to do something. But if you're not feeling well, we understand. And you got to put your own mask on first and take care of yourself, so that you can make a contribution. But I've also seen people that have gone through this journey, and it's very therapeutic for them. They find a lot of joy at making a contribution, and tried in an effort to try to make sure that nobody else has to go through what they've gone through. And that's also very powerful.
And it is very powerful emotionally and spiritually to be able to use your talents, right? And so many people feel like they can't use their talents because they're, so many opportunities have been taken away from them because of their illness. But you have created a place where people can dedicate their talents and do what God has created them to do, and that is really helpful on a healing journey. So I want to thank you for that, and I want to thank you for doing that. And I think it's one of the reasons why so many people have been trying to get you onto this podcast, because you've helped so many people in so many different ways, and many people just directly on their healing journey because you gave them an opportunity to contribute and do what it is that they were created to do.
Yeah, and the other part about Center for Lyme Action is I can't do this by myself. It is impossible. We have Lyme disease in all 50 states. We need people from all 50 states. We need people from all the 435 folks in Congress. So it really takes a village. So we are so appreciative of this group effort. one of the things that I noticed when I first started getting involved in this is that a lot of the Lyme groups really operated really independently. And Center for Lyme Action has been a place where, it doesn't matter what organization you're affiliated with. Everybody's welcome, because we're all trying to solve the same problem together. And so we have over 50, representatives from over 50 different Lyme organizations that participate in our various programs that we run to help grow federal funding for Lyme disease.
So we're at the accomplishment phase of our podcast, and I'd like to talk to you about some of the accomplishments that Nicole has touched on, but in a little more detail. So I think what has made Bonnie the star in the community, I think, is probably more the fly-ins than anything else. That's when everybody seems to be talking about you and talking about your organization. So talk to us about the fly-ins and why they are so effective, and why it's important from the standpoint of the way our government functions for folks to fly in from everywhere, because their senators and their members of the House are more likely to be supportive of your work if their constituents who live in their districts are coming and participating in the fly-in.
Yeah, so the fly-in is something I learned about from my brother, who I didn't know what he did. And when I was early days, I was saying, okay, so how do we do this? What's their best practice? He said, well, the people that are really good at this have a fly-in. What's that? And the word fly-in would mean that you get on an airplane and you fly to Washington, D.C. on a certain day. You meet as a group, and then you kind of fan out to talk to your member of Congress and your two senators. And the organization functions to help organize those meetings. So it's setting the meetings. The reason that this is so important is, believe it or not, we all live in this very cynical world, but believe it or not, your members of Congress care about what you have to say. They actually do. And the people that work for them, their staff, are paid to listen and hear what you have to say. So you will, 9 times out of 10, you will get a receptive audience to what you have to say, particularly if you're a Lyme disease patient. And so we started off, literally with, I don't know, less than 100 people who were able to do this and able to fly in. So our first fly-in was in February of 2020. Remember, 2020 was just before the pandemic started. So our fly-in just snuck right in there, right before the pandemic started. And we got a first taste of what it was like to run an in-person fly-in. We were lucky we had Senator Collins. She was very grateful for all of us, right? She came and spoke because we had just helped her pass the Cahagan-Tick Act. Because literally without these advocates, right, she would not have had that piece of legislation passed. It just wouldn't have happened because it's so hard to get those co-sponsors. But with all the activity from the advocates, it happened. But anyway, we had in February of 2020, we had our first fly-in. We hold the fly-in at a time right after the president's budget is introduced to Congress. So this is something we all learn in grade school, but forget, that the president gathers all the budget information and presents the budget and introduces a budget to Congress as the president's budget. And most of the time that serves as the baseline for what the appropriations bills will be. At least it's very significant input. And so we hold the fly-in right at the beginning of this budget process. So that's on purpose. And what happens at the fly-in is each person is given a set of materials, and we do training ahead of time, right? So each person is getting a set of materials, and we train folks on our appropriations asks. So we'll have 5 or 6 asks. So these are areas where we're asking the members of Congress to support appropriations increases for various programs in the government.
So, Bonnie, let me ask you to pause there for a second. Let's build
Yeah.
out this appropriation process and why it's so important, right? It's because
Yeah.
one of the things that I understand that motivated you to start this offshoot not-for-profit, the C4, was that there were many other diseases, including vector-borne diseases, that were being funded, and the research to study those diseases was being funded at a substantially greater rate than Lyme disease. So can you give us some contrast between how much money was available before you started your work for Lyme disease research versus other vector-borne diseases and AIDS?
Yeah.
For example?
Yeah. So the deal with Lyme disease is it's incredibly underfunded on a per patient rate. So you know, the latest numbers are in Nicole's paper, The State of Lyme Disease Research. But literally, you know, other infectious diseases like West Nile and malaria are funded at 1,000 times or 2,000 times more than Lyme disease on a per patient basis. And so we can make an argument that this is a super underfunded disease, super underfunded disease. And that's very compelling, even for people that don't want to increase the federal spending, that you're saying, look, more since 1994, almost we have 4 times the number of reported cases, and yet Lyme disease continues to be underfunded for these other less common diseases. So that's one of the major arguments that we make.
So one of the things I think is really brilliant about your story and the way that you've used every model available to bring it together under this umbrella now that's allowing us to move forward, right? Because when you are underfunded from a governmental standpoint, then you're not getting research. If you don't get, because the lifeblood of research at universities is going to be funding that's available and grant money that's available. The lifeblood of graduate students ultimately developing a career in a particular area of study is going to be the availability of grant money so that they can fund their grants, they can fund their research and do their research. So why don't you talk a little bit about why it's so important to make sure that it's not an underfunded disease, not to take away from the other, the other diseases and their advocates that have been successful. And the AIDS model is a brilliant model because they did the same thing that you did with using for-profits and not-for-profits and research and education and the advocacy, but without having the governmental resources available, we're not going to have the researchers or the research done that's necessary to overcome the billions of dollars of losses that our society is suffering as a result of millions of people suffering from these chronic diseases.
Yeah, so if you're a grad student, right, and you're in one of these life sciences areas, where are you going to make a career, and how are you going to fund? And you want to be a researcher as your career. Where are you going to place your effort? Well, right now, probably cancer, because cancer is funded at over $50 billion a year, and that's where the big money is. So having enough money, right, and enough regular funding to pay young researchers who will eventually make a career out of Lyme disease is really, really important, because you have to have, this is going to require consistent effort by really smart people in really good labs across the country to be able to do it. And so that's why the funding, particularly NIH, of course, is the biggest level of funding, but and that funding has increased almost fourfold from, let's say, when we started in FY20. I'm just looking at a piece of paper here, so I get it right. Was about 40 million, including tick-borne diseases, is up to 119 million. Yeah, so that's good. Yeah, but this is not my work. This is the work of literally 2,000 people across the country. We're all working together, all making phone calls and working as a team to talk to the right people to get the right attention to get those dollars in place.
We're not going to thank you for all the work. We're certainly going to thank you for your vision and your leadership, right? I mean, but for your vision and but for your leadership, these 2,000 people would not be able to dedicate all their talents and make the contributions they're making. So at least allow us to give you a little pat on the back if we can.
Okay, well, so that's my talent, is organizing our crew into a group of folks that are effective at making this happen.
One of the other areas that I wanted to talk to you about is not just the public research dollars that your visionary leadership has been able to acquire, but also the private research dollars and the importance of having private research dollars, in some cases as seed money, and in some cases as money that will pay for a portion or all of the research that's been done. So talk about the importance of the private research dollars in this space.
Yeah, because the big dollars all come from the NIH, basically, for research in the United States. In order to qualify for a grant from the NIH, you have to have some basic data around your idea. And without that basic data, it's really, really hard to get a grant from the NIH. And so that is the role, so critical role that a number of private foundations have played, is to basically create at least a small pool, hopefully a small and growing rapidly pool of folks who are exceptional researchers who've been able to get at least small amounts of funding to get the basic data to prove out early ideas that they have for a diagnostic or a therapy. And so that's the critical role that the private foundations have played. And there's over the last 10 years, there's well over $100 million that have been put in by private foundations into Lyme disease, Lyme and tick-borne disease research. And that role, cannot be underscored enough to actually provide the basics. I was really excited to see an NIH grant that was recently announced that announced 5 researchers that are working on what we call persistent Lyme disease, but other people call post-treatment Lyme disease, and we can talk about that. But persistent Lyme disease grants, and all 5 of those researchers were funded in some way by Bay Area Lyme Foundation. So Bay Area Lyme Foundation was involved early on in their early studies, and now those folks are going on to get R01 grants, which is 5-year, it's a multi-year grant. These are the big grants that those kinds of labs hope for.
All right, so all of these different organizations and tools have been layered together by you and your vision to put us in a position where we are getting governmental resources, certainly not enough, but more and more of them that are necessary to develop research. But that wouldn't be necessary but for the private and foundational work that was being done, which would not be available but for some of the tools that you developed as an entrepreneur or somebody who had worked in the entrepreneurial space and built that into the not-for-profit and then foundational space. So talk to us about how you layered all of that together and it became like 1,000 points of light, which you're now getting us to the place where you are certainly very optimistic about where we're going to be with diagnostic testing in the near future. And I want to talk a little bit about this report that that I'm just fascinated with, that your organization had funded and Nicole had drafted, and how that's going to be an important piece of the optimism I think many of us have with the direction that tick-borne illnesses and recovery tools are coming to. So my question is, talk to us about how you layered all of this together to get you to the point where we're now getting the research that's making you optimistic that we're going to have a diagnostic, I guess, a great diagnostic tool within the next 5 years.
There's just been an enormous expansion in the number of publications, the number of people who have been working on Lyme disease research over the last 10 years. And with that, my feeling is like, okay, something good has to happen from this. It really starts with diagnostics, and therapeutics will probably follow. That's not what we all want to hear, because we have people that are our friends and family members that are sick with Lyme and tick-borne disease. But the diagnostic part is so critical that because it's the key for actually getting therapeutics. In 2015, 2016, I worked on a project to Barry Lyme Foundation to try to figure out if we could have a standardized clinical trial protocol that would work, that could be, become a standard that could be used in clinical trials. And because when you design a clinical trial, and of course I'm not the expert in this area, but I learned a little bit about it. But when you design a clinical trial, you need to have designed outcome measures. And if you don't have those outcome measures defined in a very defined fashion, it's really hard to prove whether your patient got well or not. So it's very hard to develop therapeutics without a good diagnostic. So if you look at AIDS, there was a diagnostic for AIDS. And so you could tell whether different therapies were going to work or not. And so because the symptoms of people, particularly with the chronic condition for Lyme disease, the symptoms are so varied, and the only consistent one is pain across all of those symptoms. The types of interview level testing doesn't really give you a clear outcome measures. So the importance of diagnostics cannot be underscored. And the fact that there are these 80 projects going on in the United States, that there's this prize challenge called Lyme X, which we're very grateful for the Cohen Foundation for continuing to support and fund. The fact that it's not just universities, but it's also diagnostic businesses that
Labs,
these biotech businesses that are investing in this area. The fact that this ecosystem seems to be coming together gives me great optimism that something good will happen.
So another accomplishment we just started to tease a little bit about is this paper that Nicole had developed for you. So Bonnie, why don't you talk to us a little bit about the paper and why you and your organization selected Nicole Bell to do the work?
So one of the areas this is a very complex disease area, and people get sick real quickly, and the information that's out there trying to really summarize what is available for Lyme patients is oftentimes scattered, conflicting information. So at Center for Lyme Action, we wanted to produce a public policy paper that would be available for the public, but also help us in our mission to grow federal funding for Lyme and tick-borne disease. That would provide a clear explanation of this is where we are right now in Lyme disease research. So our vision was to create a paper that would summarize all the research, all the relevant research that is publicly available. There's a lot of stuff that's not publicly available, but all the stuff that's publicly available, and summarize that into a coherent paper that would summarize the state of Lyme disease research. And I ran across Nicole. How did I meet you, Nicole? I don't even know. How did I meet you?
So actually, Ali Moresco is someone that, I know Rick and Matt love and have interviewed multiple times. And so I actually didn't connect with Ali, but I connected with her mom, Linda.
Linda.
On social media. And so I talked to her and we had a conversation, and she was like, you know what? I need to introduce you to Bonnie. And so she was the one that connected us. And then I sent you my book, and then we kind of took it from there.
Yeah, I remember reading your book, Nicole, in like a day. It was so compelling. I'm like, oh my God, this person can write. And it's such a terrible story. Anyway, but super compelling writing. And I thought, okay, yeah, maybe Nicole can write this paper for us. because it's a very complex area, and to try to tackle, to write a summary paper like this.
Yeah,
So
so
the-
Bonnie comes to me and she's like, hey, I have this project to summarize all of Lyme disease research. Do you want to take it on? And I was like, wow, that's a huge project. I'm not sure I can do that. But we talked it over, and I think that at the end of the day, I realized it was something that I had to do, because this was what I was looking for when I was, as I mentioned earlier, I'm an engineer. I wanted to dig in. I went on PubMed, where all the papers are, and I started reading them. And that conflict and that confusion that Bonnie talked about, I experienced it because I was trying to figure out what are the best treatments. And then you read some papers and they say persistent Lyme doesn't exist, and it's all, fraudulent, as we had talked earlier. And then you read other papers and they say, oh no, there's these persister cells and they're resistant to antibiotics. And as a patient trying to, or a caregiver, trying to figure it out, I had no idea. And so, so at the end of the day, this was what I had wanted to do, but as a caregiver, I didn't have the time or frankly, the mental capacity to go ahead and do that. And then also, I think I was encouraged to take it on because of all the hard work that had been done by the Federal Tick-Borne Disease Working Group and, and other, summary groups that had gotten together and just amassed all the latest and greatest of information, the NIH strategic plan for tick-borne disease. Like, there were all these infrastructure that were already in place that I knew I could use as a foundation. And then, so I decided to say yes, and that's kind of where we went from there.
And it is a great document. So Bonnie, let's talk about the dual paths that Nicole seems to have been able to travel down with writing this, what I consider a brilliant paper. And I'm looking at it from, I think, a very different perspective than you are, Bonnie. So let's talk about your path first. I mean, your goal with this paper was to have a policy paper that you would use as part of your advocacy work for members of Congress, both the House and the Senate, and their staff. So can you first talk about that piece of that goal that you had set for Nicole, and how well you believe she's accomplished that goal?
Yeah, so because if you think about it, say you're a staff member working for one of these members of Congress, and even if you are a health LA, that's a health legislative assistant, associate, think of all the issues that even just this one policy area that you have to know about. And so knowing about Lyme disease is really, really hard. So one of the functions of advocacy groups with Congress, and it's a very important function, is to provide education materials for Congress so that they can learn about these different issues. And so we wanted to create a paper that would serve the public for public consumption and education, as well as serve as a policy paper for an policy and education paper for the staff that has, many disease issues that they are looking at. So they would have a place to, to consume this information in a consumable way and become educated on the issue. So that was the goal of the paper.
So if I can just develop this a little bit further with you. So the goal is to make sure that you have a very complex disease with a large set of issues set out with an outline that would be understandable to someone who doesn't have Lyme disease or doesn't have a family member with Lyme disease, but will be in a position where they're making decisions or recommendations to the people who are making decisions about what should or shouldn't be a part of an appropriations bill and how much money should be made available to these research efforts.
That is correct. The function of the staff in these offices is to provide, extra brain power and recommendation power for those congressional offices. And if they don't have the information, they can't make the recommendation. So that's why providing the materials and then also the other communications around the materials is so important to educate these folks so that they know, yeah, we need to have more money for Lyme disease.
So let's talk about the other path and the path that I was most interested in when I read the document. as a podcast host of a Lyme disease podcast, where we've interviewed over 400 people. I've read well over 50 books on this topic, and quite frankly have become enmeshed in trying to come up with information for people who are on the journey, especially people who are new to the journey. And what I've often been frustrated by is having the ability to point to one book or one podcast or one tool that I'd like to give to someone who's new on the journey, or a caretaker of a person who's new on the journey. And I think you folks have developed that. I mean, I think it's here with this paper that Nicole has written for your organization. I think we have, I think the index is just brilliantly developed. I think the very clear way that you have defined so many of the important topics, or maybe all of the important topics that we're trying to manage. One that jumps out at me was a discussion of congenital Lyme, for example, or neurological Lyme, or Lyme carditis, or some of these topics that are so important. And it was just so clearly outlined. The frameworks are so I think well developed, and I think the information was presented in a very clear fashion. So, Bonnie, why don't you talk to us a little bit about that other path, or that other group of people that will benefit from the work that you folks have done together?
Yeah. So producing the paper, the paper was funded by the Driscoll Family Foundation. So we want to just recognize them for their awesome contribution to this effort.
Yes, thank you.
And they, the main purpose of the paper is for public consumption, and to create a paper that summarizes the state of Lyme disease research. And I was lucky enough to meet Nicole through one of our advocates, Linda Moresco. So that was great. Who has a particular set of talents. And again, this is all about the people and all their different talents, but has the talent to take a very complex subject and make it understandable for regular folks that just want the information and need it in a clear fashion. So I agree with you. I think Nicole hit it out of the park. And I was super excited when I read this incredibly good piece of work.
Yeah, and we certainly want to encourage folks who are listening to this podcast to download the paper. And we do have a special announcement that we're going to make now. And the first thing is, we here at Tick Boot Camp know that it's very difficult in some cases for folks to consume information in different formats, right? We actually, this podcast is actually an audio only podcast, because when my co-host Matt Sabatello was at the most challenging part of his journey, he was so neurologically impaired he could not watch TV. He couldn't watch a screen. He was so light sensitive that he couldn't watch even a video. So he insisted that we do an audio only podcast, so that we could make this available to people who were neurologically impaired the way he was. But we're actually pivoting over, and we're going to start doing some more video. And one of the things that we're going to do, I think, as our first video effort, is we're going to try to turn this paper into a series of podcast interviews that I think we're going to call the Nicole Bell. I'm stuttering here, Nicole Bell series, where we're going to have Nicole break down this paper into a series of video podcasts and audio podcasts, so that if folks can't read this because of where they are in their journey, but by the way, I want folks to download it if you can read it, but we're also going to make it available in other formats. So Nicole, I've now publicly outed you, and I before the podcast I promised I wouldn't, but now that I have, so talk to us about reformatting this so that it can be available to other folks on the journey who may have some impairment issues and wouldn't be able to read your report.
Well, I mean, I think one of the goals that Bonnie and I talked about really early on is I'm a very visual person, right? So I think audio is a great way to get information, but when you're dealing with really complex technical stuff, like, a picture's worth 1,000 words is absolutely just a true statement for me in the way that I digest information. And so one of the things when we were first talking about it is I said, I want to try and tell the story as much as we can visually so that people can understand that story. And so that's where I think video really comes in, is because there's just certain pictures, there's certain images that will help solidify that information. And the goal was to make it accessible. As Bonnie said, that the primary audience is congressional staffers. And even though they may be, these HA health associates or whatever. Yeah. I'll get it wrong. They're not doctors, they're not microbiologists, they're not any of it. And so, whereas it's a very technical, weighty subject, I think we're trying to make it achievable. And so I know, Rich, you'll help me as we go through trying to digest these complex topics, because they are hard, right? I mean, that was one of the things that I was navigating with neurological disease with my husband. It's like, the brain is something that they don't even understand in the healthy state, nonetheless in a disease state, and diseases that they don't know how to diagnose. And so it's an extremely complex landscape but there is good science and there is good evidence. It's just, a matter of highlighting that. And then as Bonnie and the Center for Lyme Action are working for, is getting more research funding in to help solve the problems.
Yeah, more research and researchers. I love that part of it, Bonnie. I love that, you're affecting the career decisions that many young researchers are making. And that was something we didn't understand here at Tick Boot Camp until we actually interviewed Dr. Mather at URI. And when we interviewed Dr. Mather, one of the things that he shared with us was the importance of having grant money available to him so that he can do the research. Because if he didn't do a lot of research, he wouldn't get tenure. If he didn't get tenure, this all sort of, falls into line. I mean, we need money available for these folks to, do the research that we need them to do in order to be able to overcome this disease. And I hope this 5-year timeline that you outlined for us, Bonnie, is achievable. And like you, I agree that, we as difficult as it is when we're dealing with people who are trying to manage this disease, if we can't define the disease and we can't define what they need with a diagnostic tool, I'm not sure who we ultimately target the treatment tools. So hopefully we can do it even faster than 5 years, because it just sucks that so many people are suffering. So why don't we talk, Bonnie, a little bit now about your transformation, right? And how this process of advocating for folks in the Lyme community has taught you about yourself and taught you about your spiritual mission and how you can serve at a higher level than you ever believed possible before you started this.
Wow. Yeah, so I'm not all that great talking about myself. I'd rather give credit to other people. So I think that's probably the key thing that I learned is that I am really grateful for everyone around me who has believed in this mission and gone the extra mile to make that extra phone call or made that extra communication or attended something so they could learn more. All those people around me, the people that the researchers that are spending their time and talent, the funders who are spending their treasure on trying to find solutions, the people that organize these foundations, and it's not easy to run a foundation, right? The people like Linda Giampa at Barry Lyme Foundation, I'm insanely grateful for all the work that they put into it. I'm grateful for, my brother. I'm sorry that he has 2 kids with Lyme disease, but I'm grateful for my brother that he and I, found a project to work on that's been really fun. And and that we found Meredith, who was our government affairs director. And I'm grateful that, our friend Linda introduced us to Nicole. And now I've met you, Rich. It's been great.
It has been great. And so, we one of the things we've come to unfortunately learn here at Tick Boot Camp is there are a number of different types of Lyme wars. We learned about the Lyme wars early on in this podcast relating to the way doctors interface with one another. One of the things we've unfortunately observed here at Tick Boot Camp is that there are Lyme wars between not-for-profits as well, and these organizations compete against each other and fight with one another. And one of the things that I think you should be given, I think, the greatest amount of credit for is you seem to have the ability to soothe the Lyme wars down wherever they are and bring people under the umbrella of this brilliant organization you've created, and use every single model layered together to allow this community to come together in a way that I think gives me more optimism than almost any other person that I've met here, doing this podcast for the last 4 years. I am really energized by the work that you've done, Bonnie. I'm really blessed to have met you and have watched you over all the years. And now I know why you're such a star. All the dynamic work that you're doing and your ability to bring people together, and of course give credit to everyone other than yourself, which is also a really beautiful part of your spirit. So thank you for all the great work you do, and thank you for joining us here at Tick Boot Camp.
It's been a pleasure, Rich, and great to talk with you too, Nicole.